Hello. This is going to serve as the lab session for PSC 603 for scheduled originally for February 14th. What I am going to do tonight is merge the two things that I need to do. The first is to kind of go back over some of what we covered in the lab on February 7th. With respect to the same data set that I used then, I'm going to go back over some examples because the screen share did not record properly in Zoom. And then the second thing that I am going to do is show you the assignment spreadsheet and explain the assignment, which will also be emailed, and explain what I'm expecting as part of that assignment. The deadline for the assignment will be midnight or 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, February 21st. So during the lab session on the 21st, which will be a live lab session at the end of our lecture on the 21st, I will take some time at the beginning to answer any questions that people have with respect to lab. You are also free to email me your questions as well. So what I'm going to do now is screen share. Again, this is the data set that we used in the lab on February 7th. What I have done is I've created a couple of examples, which I have here in notes. These are basically, and I've reset all the other information, but what I have done here is just basically created some notes, and I'm going to go through each note as an example. As you can see, first column, column A, revenue and expenditures, indicates whether the account's revenue or expenditure. You have your division number, you have your category or the type of account, you have the object code, which is really the account code, the description of the account. Then columns F through H are 3 prior year actual information. So this would be prior actuals for fiscal years 19, fiscal year 20, and fiscal year 21. Then columns I and J are your current year budget information. I is column fiscal year 22 adopted. J is fiscal year 22 revised. K is fiscal year 22 year to date, and this is as of the end of December. So in a typical North Carolina fiscal year, where the year begins on July 1st and ends on June 30th, this would mean that you have completed 6 months of spending or revenue raising, as the case may be. Column L is encumbrances, which is there just to show you that encumbrances are a part of budgeting, but it's not something we're going to actively use in these assignments, or at least not yet. Fiscal year, column M is fiscal year 22 remaining, which is the subtraction of column K. Well, it's column J minus column K. It's column J minus column K minus column L, but in most cases, what we're really talking about is column K, I'm sorry, the column J amount minus the column K amount. So that tells you how much is remaining in the account as for the current fiscal year. The 2 columns that you will be involved in updating for these accounts in the assignment are columns N and O. Fiscal year, column N is fiscal year 22 end of year projection or projected, and fiscal year 23 recommended or next fiscal year's budget request is column O. So what I want to do is go through each of these examples and explain them to the best of my ability. So let's look at this first account, row 2, state grant. You will note here, and let me scroll down a little bit because it did cut off. You will note that there's a note here that says that this division of the Parks Department is scheduled to receive a $20,000 grant for capital equipment purchases in fiscal year 23. So what we would do in that case is we would need to show revenue for that line in 23, and then also because it's tied to capital equipment, we need to go ahead and adjust the expenditure. So what I'm going to do in fiscal year 23 recommended is I'm going to enter in $20,000 of revenue. And as I said before, when we do this kind of accounting in budgeting, because everything's in the same table with the way that these systems operate internally, you typically show revenues as a negative number and expenditures as a positive number. So if this is $20,000 in revenue, we would show it as a negative. So I type in negative 20,000. And then I've done that. What I now need to do is show the corresponding expenditure. So I scroll down to the bottom, and as you can see here, I've already identified this account, which is a capital account. It's in the category of capital outlay. It's an expenditure account. As you see here in column A, again, capital outlay, as you see here in column C, for other equipment, you can see I've put a note, funds for capital expenditure funded by grant. So I need to book in the budget request $20,000 as an expenditure, which is positive $20,000. So I simply click on the cell and enter 20,000. So I've done that. Now, what I'm going to do for the remainder of these is I'm going to scroll in a little tighter, or zoom in a little tighter so you can see it, and go through each of these examples. The next line that we have, row 3, this is revenue from the ropes course, which is a fee-based program we provide here at the city. We had projected, we had originally adopted a projection of $2,000 in revenue, but we are now projecting that we are going to finish the year with 25% in attendance compared to fiscal year 20. So in fiscal year 20, if we go back to fiscal year 20 in the history, you will see that we had $3,960 in actual revenue. So if I wanted to know 25% of that number to put in the fiscal year 2022 end of year projection, I would go to column N, or cell N3 in this case. I would highlight it, and then I would enter in, I would go equals, because I'm going to do a formula, equals. I would then go over and pick the cell that I want to compare to, which is 2020 actual, G3, and multiply that, so star symbol, by 25%, or in this case by 0.25. So the formula in this matter is G3 times 0.25, hit enter, and that gives me $990. Now we are expecting 100% attendance compared to FY20 in 2023. So in that case, for fiscal 23, I would go to that cell and just simply equal the reference, which is fiscal year 2020. So it's a simple equals G3, hit enter, and I've adjusted the budget to $3,960. So that's the first two examples. The next example is an example of looking at the year to date and deciding if an adjustment needs to be made in projection reflected on the year to date amount. As you can see, there's $550 that's already been received this year. The original budget was $500. So what I need to do with the end of year projection is actually increase it to this amount of 550 at the very least. So I would type in negative 550, and that's my revised end of year projection. From that, I also see the note that says that we're increasing fees by 10% in fiscal year 23. So what I want to do in this case is I want to multiply, because I've revised the projection to an amount greater than the original budget. I want to increase this account to reflect 10% more than what we will actually collect this year. So for fiscal year 23 recommended on this account, I do the formula, which is equals N8, my end of year projection for the current year, times a 10% increase, which would be 110% or 1.1. Hit enter. And as you can see, it's increased it by 10%, and that revised up to $605. Now I will show the projection. Now, so those are the three revenue examples that I wanted to give. Now I will show the expenditure examples. The first one is salaries and wages. What I am doing here is I am projecting a 3% increase for fiscal year 23. So that's pretty simple. I click on the recommended and I type in a formula. So what we want is a number that equals the adopted budget of that year, which is I-13, and I multiply it by a 3% increase, which is 103%, or in this case, 1.03. Hit enter, and it adjusts it by 3%. So I go down to the next example. And this one, I believe, if I'm correct, was fuel. And I have given instruction here, usage reduced permanently by 50% of budget. So what that tells me is I need to adjust my current year projection by 50%, and then on top of it, I need to anticipate that fuel costs are going to go up 10% in fiscal year 23. So I go to the projected column, which is in 27, to the projected cell, which is in 27, and I equal, again, go back to adopted, which is 500 times 50%, so 0.5. That gives me $250. So I'm projecting in the current fiscal year that I'll only spend $250. I want to increase that by 10% for fiscal year 23. So I go over to the next cell, which is the fiscal year 23 column, click equal in 27 times 10% increase, which is 110%, or in this case, 1.1 as a multiple. And that gives me my revised number, which is $275. This is an example where you have to do some estimation. In this example, we're looking at utilities. You can see that utilities are a little sporadic. The 3-year average, we're adjusting for prior year activity. And as you can see, in the last 2 years, utilities have gone down to 2441 and 2340. So in this circumstance, we can look at that, and we do not have to be exact. You kind of want to eyeball it and look at the numbers. You also look at where you are for half year, and you're at 1112. So based on this information, the general average between 2440 and 2340 is a little under 2400. That would be, if you added the two together and divided it by 2, it'd be about 24, it'd be a little less than 2400. But when you're budgeting, you want to give yourself some wiggle room. When you're budgeting conservatively, you want to slightly overestimate your revenue, your expenditures, slightly overestimate your expenditures to make sure you have some cushion, and then slightly underestimate your revenues so that you actually achieve some degree of surplus. That's kind of how, that's a good key with budgeting. So if the average is a little less than 2400, I want to set the number that I want to use at 2400 to give me a couple dollars cushion. So for the projected field, I'm going to adjust that to 2400. It's also consistent with a 6-month total, which is a little less than 1200. 1200 is half of 2400. And then I'm going to adjust next year's to 2400 as well. Now we come to other services, row 38. You will see here that we have a revised budget of $60,146 that we have not spent, but I've noted that the funds will be spent in their entirety in fiscal year 22. So I should show that total number. So type in 60,146. I am also requesting $20,000 in fiscal year 23 to start a new program. So that should be $20,000 in 23. And then the last item I want to show you is motor vehicles. We have 2 vehicles scheduled for purchase in fiscal year 23. They're $15,000 each. So the formula is very simple. For the fiscal year 23 recommended, it would be equals 15,000 times 2, which gets you $30,000. And we've already adjusted this other equipment account below it to reflect that grant that we also acknowledged in the revenue account earlier. So these are just some examples of how you make changes in the budget in your budget request to reflect end of year projections for the current fiscal year, as well as what you are recommending for next fiscal year. So I want to go back and again show how pivot tables are done, because what I want to do is create a pivot table that provides subtotals by category for this division. For the actual, the last fiscal year 21, the adopted, revised, and projected for 22, and the recommended for 23. So I come up here to my ribbon, click on Insert, and then I click on Pivot Table, which is the first action that appears, the first icon that appears below. Click on the icon. It'll say pivot, this wizard will appear saying pivot table from table or range. It'll automatically queue the range, which is A1 to Q45. I scroll down and I look and see that there's a moving dotted line that's around it, and it's covering all of these accounts. So the range has been properly set by Excel. You can choose where you want the table to be placed. My preference, and I strongly recommend it, is always be placed in a new worksheet. So I click on OK, and it'll open up this new worksheet, worksheet 1. So what I want to do is I want to separate it out by revenue and expenditure account. So the first thing I want to do is set my rows, which is how we set up the subtable, the subtotaling, based on different identifiers. So the first one that I'm going to, and so what I'll do is right click and hold down over revenue and expenditure, and then drag it down to rows. And you will see here that now it's got row labels, EXP and REV, expenditure and revenue. The other field that I want to use for a subtotal is category. So I click on category, left click on category, scroll it down, hold it down, scroll down to rows, put it beneath revenue and put it beneath so it should appear below it. And so as you can see here, it's now added the various categories we have of revenue categories and expenditure categories. What I would like is for my revenues to appear above my expenditures. So I click on the cell that has the rev label, and then I kind of move up to the edge where the 4 arrow cursor appears. I hold down and left click, I'm sorry, and I scroll it up to where that dark line appears above EXP. And as you can see here, it has moved revenues above expenditures. So now I add the fields that have the values in it that I want to subtotal. The first one I said was fiscal year 21 actual. So I left click on fiscal 21 actual, and I hold it down and drag it down to values. As you see there, the numbers appear. Next, I want fiscal year 22 adopted, do the same thing. Then revised. Then I wanted to see end of year projection. And lastly, I wanted to see recommended. And so my data is here. What I would like to do is, as you can see, it is tiered the subtotaling upward. So for example, you'll see that the subtotal of revenues is above categories. That doesn't make a lot of sense, so I actually want to put the subtotals for revenue below the categories. So I go over to design, which is on the far right of the top ribbon. I click on the subtotals icon, and I say show all subtotals at bottom of group. So as you see here is made that adjustment. So you have the subtotals for each category of revenue. Then you have the subtotal for revenues total. Then you have the subtotal for each category of expenditure. You have the subtotal for total expenditures. Then you have the grand total below, which is going to net revenues and expenditures. It's going to add revenues and expenditures together. And again, revenues are negative. So it's going to show you what the net budget is. And for a department like this, that means that positive amount that you see here, like if I come down to the end for fiscal year 23 recommended, it shows $161,390.70. That is the amount that then I have to find general revenue for from taxes and other general revenue sources. That would also be considered the subsidy that the government pays for the services provided by this division. Now, I want to clean up how these numbers look. So I'm going to highlight all of these columns B through F. Once they're highlighted, I'm going to right click. And then these menu bars appear. I want to click on the comma because I want it in comma style. And as you can see, it moves it to comma style, so it adds columns for every 1,000 at the thousands marker. It also converts those negative numbers into, from having a minus sign to having the parentheses, makes it a little bit easier to read. So that is, again, just kind of going back over the examples that I showed in the lab on February 7th in terms of how to work with a budget worksheet. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, and let me close off the share for a second. So the next thing that I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the sheet for the lab assignment. This would be for lab assignment number 1. It will be emailed. You should have received it in an email. It is also available in the on the Google Drive in the February 7th week folder. So this is now available. And again, this is the spreadsheet you use for your lab assignment. So go back. Okay, so as you see here, we have another division of the Parks and Recreation Department. What I have done is I have set the projected columns for the current fiscal year 22, and the recommended for fiscal year 23. They are set as a default to the adopted level for fiscal year 22. Typically, when you work with a budget submission, you typically start with where you were the prior year or the current year. That's typically how it works. You're working out in an incremental basis, so you kind of start off with the current year's adopted budget kind of as your guide, and then you make adjustments from there. That's how most places do it, and that's how I've done it throughout my tenure of working with local governments. What I have done is for each account, I have provided assumptions. And it is your responsibility, based on the assumptions that I provide in column O, to then make adjustments to the information in columns M and N. So that's your assignment. So you can see how I've made these adjustments. Now, I am not asking you to necessarily forecast unless I tell you specifically. I'm not asking you to make projections on the fiscal year 22 projected based on year to date, unless you notice that the year to date is already greater than the adopted, or that the revised is greater than the adopted. So if you see that there needs to be an adjustment for that, you should make it. If you see that the year to date is greater than the adopted and revised, you should make it. But otherwise, do not make adjustments to the projected unless I ask you to in the assumptions. So you will adjust these numbers based on the assumptions, on the information provided in the assumptions. Again, you're working with both revenues and expenditures. There's a total, if I am correct, of 48 accounts. But you will not need to necessarily do anything to all of those accounts. Some of the accounts you will leave alone, but follow the assumptions with respect to whether or not you should do things to the accounts. And the only changes you are making are to the projected amount for fiscal year 22, which is column M, and the recommended amount for fiscal year 23, which is column N. So the only changes you're going to make are in columns M or N. When you are done, you will of course need to save this. You will also need to create on a separate sheet within this document. So you're going to be working in the same worksheet. I'm sorry, in the same workbook. You need to create a separate sheet or a separate tab to do a pivot table. That pivot table is pretty much what I showed you how to do just in a couple of minutes ago. And that is that you want a subtotal first on the basis of revenue and expenditure, showing revenues first and expenditures second. And then below that, same format as I showed you before, you will want to have whether it's have it subtotal by revenue, then category. So from a tier perspective, it should be revenue, then the revenue categories, expenditure, then the expenditure categories, and then the grand total for the division as a whole, the net. You will want that information for the same fields that I showed, that I made the example out before: fiscal year 21 actual, fiscal year 22 adopted, fiscal year 22 revised, fiscal year 22 projected, and fiscal year 23 recommended. So that is the assignment. And again, the assignment is due by 11:59 p.m. on Monday, February 21st. You will need to email the assignment to me. And in the email, there were some directions about how I want the assignment, the email labeled, to make sure that I can properly differentiate the assignments. Again, if you have any questions, you are free to email me or text me. I do apologize for the delay in getting this out. I've been having some serious computer troubles and problems with Zoom. This is probably the 4th time that I've tried to record this. And I'm hoping, and I think I got it worked out. I've tested everything before I did this recording and everything was working. So good luck and take care. And I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have directly. And we can go over those questions as well during the lab portion of our class on February 21st. Have a good evening.